Thank you, Anthony. Welcome everyone from me as well to this digital dialogues series of the Philosopher. And thank you, Steve, for being here today to discuss the book you co-wrote with Lawrence Shapiro, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People. Let's start maybe with a summary of the book. There's a lot of bad thinking out there that leads to phenomena like climate change denial, anti-vaxxers, people believing that the earth is flat, conspiracy theories about the 2020 US elections. Why are these phenomena best explained as bad thinking in your view? And how can philosophy help? I mean, philosophy can maybe help us with the rules of logic, the rules of thought, if you like. You know, it can tell us what conclusions follow from what premises. But it isn't entirely clear, to begin with at least, that what's wrong with people who believe, say, in the QAnon conspiracy theory, is that they need to brush up on their Aristotelian logic.
Good questions, all. What we're calling bad thinking in the book is essentially irrationality. And it's a broad kind of irrationality because it's about both how people come to have the beliefs they have and why they hold on to those beliefs beyond any reasonable evidence. So by irrationality or bad thinking, we don't mean people who are dumb or ignorant. Ignorance is simply a lack of information, a lack of knowledge. What dumbness, I suppose, can be defined as not having the tools to draw the right conclusions or to think well. But many of the people who are engaging in bad thinking are very well educated, and they're not dumb, they're smart. What we mean by irrationality is, first of all, that they come to hold these beliefs on inadequate grounds. That is, the beliefs are not justified. There may be many reasons why a person comes to hold a belief. They may find the belief comforting, and I suppose that that's the reason why many people believe in the existence of God or have other religious beliefs. They might find the belief comforting, or they might believe it because they have faith or trust in somebody who passed along some information to them. But if the belief is not justified, if the person does not come to hold the belief because they have confronted evidence in favor of the truth of the belief, then they have not come to the belief in a rational manner. So even though there may be good reasons why you have that belief, they have to be what philosophers call epistemic reasons that point to the truth or the high degree of probability of the belief. Second, it's one thing to form a belief in a rational manner and come to hold it in the face of evidence. But when you hold on to a belief in the face of counter evidence, that is, when you're confronted with evidence, or when you should be looking for evidence that the belief may not be true or is in fact clearly false, that's the other side of irrationality. That's what we in the book call epistemic stubbornness. In short, you need to tailor your beliefs to the evidence. And a person who doesn't tailor their beliefs to the evidence, and especially refuses to give up beliefs in the face of evidence that they're false, is being irrational. And to our mind, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was going to ask you more about this epistemic stubbornness and the sort of resistance to what you call the evidentialist sort of principle, right? The idea that no one should believe in something unless they have sufficient evidence for it, and the opposite of it, which is that people should give up their beliefs when there's evidence that those beliefs are false. But isn't part of the problem here that not so much the available evidence, as it were, for believing in something or not believing in something, but that none of us really have direct evidence for most of the things we believe in, right? We form our beliefs by trusting sources that we think are reliable, that we think are accurate, be it newspapers or textbooks or authority figures. So isn't the issue that people trust different sources and therefore end up forming different beliefs as a result? After all, you say that in your book, you say that the anti-vaccination movement believers think they have all sorts of evidence that supports their position, and they think that everyone else is sort of not following that evidence or not aware of it.
I think that's right. And that's the other side of bad thinking is an inability or refusal to properly evaluate or assess the evidence. It's, in a way, it's sort of evidence about your evidence. And I think that the people who deny climate change as a human activity are people who refuse to get vaccinated because they think the vaccine is dangerous or it's part of some deep state plot. People who think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump by a cabal of cannibalistic, child enslaving Democrats. There's some evidence that is just so blatantly absurd because it's got a low degree of probability relative to the background evidence. So imagine, for example, what would have to be the case for a deep state to exist being run by a cabal of cannibalistic Democrats. The probability of that evidence is so low that it really should have no weight when confronted with the overwhelming amount of evidence to the contrary. And so it's not just a matter of forming beliefs on the basis of evidence, but good thinking entails being able properly to evaluate and assess evidence. Some people watch Fox News and some people read the New York Times. And I don't think it takes a lot of deep thought to be able to evaluate the agendas of the sources of evidence and the ways in which the evidence is being presented to you. So you're absolutely right. There's a much deeper dimension to bad thinking. Not all sources of evidence are equal. Some people speak about the democratization of information that comes through social media. Well, that's a lovely idea. But if by democratization you mean that we should take all evidence at face value, that's really dangerous. People are posting on Wikipedia, on all sorts of conspiracy theory websites, and just because it's posted online does not make it good, reasonable evidence with a high degree of probability.
The title of your book is How Bad Thinking Can Happen to Good People, which reminded me a little bit of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, which, tried to explain why those from opposite sides of the ideological spectrum see each other as bad people, but in fact, they simply have different moral psychologies or something like that. And I thought from your title that your book was also going to be something similar, namely argue that, bad thinking doesn't make you bad. But in fact, you do go on to say that bad thinking is a character flaw deserving of blame. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. I do think that even good people have some blameworthy characteristics. Having faults, I have my faults, I have my character faults, and you can ask my children about those someday. But it doesn't make me being perhaps a little bit impatient or maybe being more severe than I ought to be doesn't make me a bad person. And so we didn't want to engage in name calling. We didn't want to say that bad thinking makes you a bad person. It's a really interesting question about whether good thinking could happen to a bad person. I'm skeptical, in fact, that if you're really a good thinker, you will be a bad person. On that, I tend to believe with Aristotle, for example, who thinks that the wise person will be virtuous in many ways and not just intellectually.
Right.
And to be sure, a lot of bad thinking happens among a lot of bad people. It's always hard to tell whether a bad person really is engaging in bad thinking or if they're using reason in a cynical way. I'll just take the case of Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is a bad person. The question is, does he really believe all of the things he says, or is he simply using them as political devices? Does he know what he's saying is false, or does he really believe them? Many years ago, Harry Frankfurt distinguished telling a lie from bullshitting. When you're telling a lie, you know very well what the truth is, and your intention is to deceive others. In the case of bullshitting, you really don't care one way or the other about what's true. I think if you're a bullshitter, you're probably more likely to be a bad person if that bullshitting is done in a habitual and malicious way. But the people we're concerned with are not malicious. I think they're able we're assuming with good intentions to be rational, and perhaps just need that little bit of nudge towards being more epistemologically responsible.
Can you give us, I mean, in your book, you go through a number of, more specific kinds of bad thinking, inductive reasoning by enumeration, drawing conclusions from, very small sample sizes and so on. What do you think is the worst kind of bad thinking that you spot repeatedly? What is the main, as it were, culprit?
I think the main culprit might be a kind of rush to judge, or haste, or impatience, forming your beliefs on the very first pieces of evidence that you get. When you look at people who deny the importance of getting vaccinated against the COVID, they really limit the range of material that they're considering. They find this or that somewhere on a website and immediately draw a conclusion without taking into account the broader context of the evidence they've read, or the source, or without seeking out confirmation. So, we have all sorts, and I leave this more to psychologists. Why do people engage in confirmation bias? And why do they usually seek out not evidence that might falsify their beliefs, but evidence that confirms it? So I think the haste or the impatience or the rush to judgment inform our beliefs immediately without digging deeper, without pursuing more and more evidence, both about the belief itself and about the sources of belief.
Yeah. So since you mentioned confirmation bias as one of the forms of bad thinking that is the most kind of troubling, looking only at the evidence that confirms one's beliefs, while discarding or explaining away evidence that goes against what one already believes. But isn't it the case that, as Thomas Kuhn famously showed in The Structure of Scientific Revolution, that even scientists, the paradigmatic case of rational thinkers and careful observers, also fall victim to this kind of thinking? So when working within a scientific paradigm, so Kuhn argues, scientists tend to discard or interpret away evidence that seems to go against their favorite theory. And that goes on for quite some time until it's kind of untenable. So if scientists can't avoid confirmation bias, what makes you think that ordinary folk, and on issues that are a lot more emotive and personal than whether a particular scientific theory is true or not, are able to avoid that?
Because we are naive optimists. So of course, philosophers also engage in bad thinking. They have throughout history. And one might object to our book. The subtitle of the book is How Philosophy Can Save Us from Ourselves. And our hope is that with a greater degree of philosophical tutorials, learning the lessons of philosophy, and I don't just mean the very technical lessons of formal and informal logic, different kinds of fallacies, but considering more deeply what it is to lead an examined life, to use Socrates' phrase. I think we optimistically, but not unreasonably optimistically, hope that greater exposure to philosophy and its lessons can help people avoid these mistakes. So yes, philosophers are often guilty of bad thinking, but that should not be taken to undermine philosophy itself. Philosophers, believe it or not, are human beings, and thus are prone to all sorts of whatever emotional or practical or other sorts of things that might interfere with good thinking or might lead them to make mistakes about evidence. So I don't think we should take the errors of scientists throughout history and philosophers throughout history to impugn philosophy and science itself as disciplines.
Let me press you a little bit more on that, sort of why philosophers might also be bad thinkers, because that was something I wanted to ask you. So your main philosophical work is in early modern philosophy, in particular you work on Spinoza quite a lot. And I was thinking, that period of philosophy in particular shows us how reason can lead philosophers either astray or at least down very different conclusions, right? Believing in very contradictory things. Spinoza thought there was only one substance, whereas, his fellow rationalist Leibniz ends up believing the total opposite, that there are myriads of monads and substances. Hume believes that the self doesn't exist. And on the other hand, Descartes saw the existence of the self as one of the key certainties in the world. So, if philosophers are so good at reasoning and such good thinkers, wanting to tell the rest of us how to think, what do we make of all these accounts of their enormous disagreements, of course, which continue till this day? Philosophers don't tend to agree with each other.
If philosophy is such a great source of truth, why have we really resolved to everyone's satisfaction failed to resolve to everyone's satisfaction so many philosophical problems? Why are we still debating about free will and the existence of God and so on? Here's a cheap way of answering your question, and that is, and I'm not sure I accept this way, but I'll throw it out there. That philosophers are not really trying to establish what's true, but they're trying to give you a perspective on things that will, and there you can fill in the blank, that will make your life better, that will ease cognitive dissonance, or perhaps help you better make sense of the world around you and sense of yourself. I do actually think, though, that philosophy as a discipline, if not in all, at least in many cases, many source of problems, is after the truth. And I think your question is a fascinating one, because we do want to know, well, look, if Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz are all starting with the same definition of what it is to be a substance, how can they draw such radically different conclusions? And the answer must be either that they're really not starting with the same definition of substance, that they're modifying in some ways, and we do see differences in the ways in which philosophers define that notion, or that someone's making a mistake here. So Spinoza would say to Descartes, well, look, we agree on what it is to be a substance, but your mistake is you're allowing there to be an equivocation. So Descartes famously says that substance is whatever, you can let me know if I'm going too far into the weeds of 17th century philosophy here. Descartes says that by substance, that means whatever is in itself and is conceived through itself. That's sort of the general, or what is truly ontologically independent. And Descartes then says, well, look, strictly speaking, only God is truly ontologically independent. But Descartes says the notion of substance in that case is equivocal. We can say that human beings and giraffes and trees are substances because we will allow that they are, while dependent upon God, they're not independent upon anything else. Well, Spinoza can be read as coming along and saying, well, why allow for this equivocation? Let's speak strictly, and strictly speaking, only God or nature is a substance. Leibniz will come along and he'll actually modify the definition of substance somewhat, and will say that, well, no, you have to also add to this notion of substance activity and simplicity. And so with that change, and so it's the really interesting work among people who are scholars in the history of philosophy is to figure out, among other things, why do they have these differences? Why do they draw different conclusions? But also, why do they adopt different starting points that lead them down different paths?
Yeah, so not necessarily that one of them is making a mistake, but maybe they are conceiving of what they're talking about in different ways.
It's very often they're talking past each other.
Yeah,
and very often they're not, and somebody is making a mistake. I think whatever would explain any disagreements among reasonable people will apply to these philosophers as well.
You started your answers earlier by saying this isn't about people being dumb or people being uneducated. Some very educated people end up being really bad thinkers. And you say somewhere in your book that what counts as evidence for belief may vary from person to person because of differences in people's background knowledge. So if you know something that someone else doesn't know, then something is evidence for you that might not be evidence for someone else. So if we take an extreme example, I don't know, if you're a trained biologist and you look through a microscope, you might see evidence of something that an untrained biologist just wouldn't be able to recognize. But when we apply this to, the broader culture and politics and things like that, are we getting at something different, namely that differences in education do matter, and it's not just differences in thinking? To what extent do you think that people's divergence in beliefs about the world or about politics is down to differences also in education? you cite in your introduction of your book a survey that shows, to what extent many Americans are ignorant of, quite basic facts about the world or the way the government works. And you try to move away from that. But then this observation that you made that, what actually counts as evidence depends on your background knowledge and your background beliefs, brought that subject back into my mind. So what do you say to that?
I think you could draw from our book a real serious program of educational reform. I mean, one of the recommendations we do make is that more people should be exposed to philosophy. And I would take that across the board to all sorts of disciplines, but we're focusing on philosophy. Even at a younger age, there's no reason why children or adolescents cannot be exposed to philosophy in elementary school and high school. But this is also true. I mean, one of the troubling things, which we only touch on in the book, is the way in which the humanities at large are treated by politicians, by journalists, and perhaps in the culture more broadly. At a meeting recently for parents of incoming students at the University of Wisconsin, one parent asked, well, look, I'm spending all this money on tuition. How can I justify my son or daughter taking a course in 19th century Russian literature or in art history and the Renaissance and so on? And my response to that parent was, well, look, if you're spending this much money on tuition, you better hope that they're taking courses on 19th century Russian literature or Renaissance art or early American colonial history and so on, because you're sending your child or your student to a university, not a technical or vocational school, which, with all due respect to technical and vocational schools, are extremely important for keeping society going. But our citizens need to be well educated. And as you said, you must come to life. Your life as a citizen, your life as a parent, your life as an employee, whatever you do in your profession, with a set of background beliefs that are not gathered haphazardly or irresponsibly off the internet, but through serious education in the humanities and in the sciences, so that when you are ready to form beliefs about vaccines, about climate change, about the Holocaust, or whatever it may be, you can do so and do so well.
So this is the idea that sort of an education in the humanities is invaluable because it gives you sort of useful facts or useful kind of bits of knowledge, but that it trains you in some way to discern evidence, to research things yourself, to be able to, tell what sources might be reliable and which sources might not be reliable, that sort of thing.
I think, yes, it absolutely trains you to be a good thinker. I think somebody who's had a solid education in the humanities or the sciences, whether it's literary theory, which also deals with evidence, art history, and of course the natural and social sciences, it's hard to believe that somebody who is a good thinker and has learned how to evaluate evidence and has learned how to tailor their beliefs in ways that are justified could possibly come to the conclusion that the Holocaust did not happen, that vaccines are a greater danger than the virus they're meant to protect us against, and that climate change is a political hoax by some left-wing environmentalists.
Yeah. So since I'm someone who agrees with you about most of those things, right, about what I take to be the correct views, climate change is real, COVID isn't caused by 5G networks, vaccines work.
What about Brexit?
Yeah, and I mean, Brexit is interesting because I guess it's a question of whether it's only factual or evaluative, but I've written about it, so my views about it are very kind of public, and of course I thought it was a bad idea for many reasons. But I do need to pose this kind of more Nietzschean objection, as it were, And the Nietzschean objection would be something like, you simply think that whoever doesn't agree with you on a list of things is a bad thinker, and whoever it does is a good thinker. And all you're trying to do is basically impose your views by dressing them up with this kind of cloak of respectability, calling it philosophy, calling it good thinking, using your position of authority as a professor, when in fact, your beliefs aren't any better than anyone else's. So what do you say to that kind of Nietzschean objection?
If it were true, I would not be a very good person and I would not be a good thinker. The difference is that we're perfectly willing to engage people, or we should be. Even those who are good thinkers should be perfectly willing to engage others in debate, where each side gets to present its evidence and assess that evidence. So, it just so happens that sometimes the conclusions you draw from the evidence happen to align with your political beliefs or your moral values and so on. But it's, I think in reading the book, one should see that we're not simply imposing our beliefs. In fact, on the contrary, we're saying, look, we're not telling you to believe anything in substance. The book is not, you should believe X, you should believe Y, you should believe Z, but rather, here's how you should form your beliefs. It's in a way, it's a treatise on philosophical method on becoming a rational person. So, it just so happens that we do give examples of bad thinking, which involve beliefs which are clearly false on the basis of the evidence, that they're, or if not absolutely clearly false, highly improbable, and therefore no responsible person should believe them. But we give you reasons for that. We wouldn't be good philosophers if we were simply saying you should believe this, this, and this.
Is there like an example of something that sort of good thinking you think leads to a conclusion that is just really hard to accept, and you yourself have found sort of resistant to?
You mean it's hard to accept for the good thinker, or hard for other people to accept?
Well, hard to accept for someone who starts out as a good thinker, but then reaches a conclusion that is so, unpalatable that they resist believing in it.
I think you can cite lots of cases. I'm trying to come up with one in my own life where you're disappointed when you see that you're forced to believe something that you were hoping is not true. But a good thinker will embrace that belief despite their resistance, despite the emotional difficulty or the practical difficulty of coming to accept it. I can think of instances where I didn't want to believe my son was lying about something, but in the end, there was no way to avoid that conclusion. Why was the fan in your window facing outwards?
I see. Okay.
You could think of more serious cases, and I do think that a lot of the people who were behind the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol and who felt that Trump was somehow qualified, they've experienced the disappointment that comes when they finally have to confront the evidence. You're in a situation of cognitive dissonance, and eventually something has to go. And when the evidence or the probability of the belief is so high that you might have to jettison one of your background beliefs, and that happens all the time. That a good thinker doesn't just assess the new belief on the basis of their background beliefs, but sometimes the evidence in favor of the new belief is so strong that you have to revise your background beliefs, and that's what a epistemically responsible person does. They go, life hopefully is long, and you can't go through life with a gorilla grip on your background beliefs, refusing to modify them in the face of new experiences.
Although again, one would argue that a lot of philosophers very rarely change their minds about things. People always say, well, Hilary Putnam was such a good example of a philosopher who revised his views several times, but obviously he was in many ways an exception. You talk about bad thinking as a kind of epidemic or a pandemic, and I was wondering how far you want to press that metaphor. Is bad thinking really contagious in a way? Does it go viral in ways that good thinking maybe doesn't?
I do think it is. You could say that, well, look, there's always been bad thinking. There was bad thinking in the 6th century, there was bad thinking in the 14th century, and there's bad thinking today. So how can it really be an epidemic if it's such a constant presence in our lives, in our civilizations? But then again, if the norm is good thinking, if the norm is epistemic rationality, then any departure from that, no matter how long it's been going on, is an illness. And I do think I like your way of comparing it to an infectious disease. I do think that it's become more easy to spread this virus of bad thinking with social media. There are many more sources of information now, and they come at you much more quickly and with a visual and emotional impact that they wouldn't have had 50 years ago, much less 100 years ago. And so I do think, people use the term of something going viral. I think bad information goes viral. And people are too quick, going back to your earlier question, people are much too quick to accept at face value something that has the visual or the emotional punch that it can easily have when it's in the form of a GIF or a meme or any of the ways in which the internet spreads ideas.
Yeah, and sadly there is a study from MIT that sort of showed that bad sort of false information travels faster and further on the internet than the correction of the false information.
And it's and like a virus, it's dangerous. If you think of all the events of the last 5 or 6 years, I would even go back 20 years, in politics, in military actions across the board. Bad thinking is dangerous because it's going to exacerbate. So if you just take the COVID case, the refusal to get vaccinated on the basis of superstitious or irrational beliefs exacerbates the virulence of the pandemic and puts other people's lives in danger.
Is bad thinking contextual? Is it relative to time and place? So was believing that the earth was flat bad thinking in the past, given that evidence for the contrary was in some ways always there? And we have the example, and I think you cite it, of ancient Greek astronomer Eratosthenes, who not only deduced that the earth was round, but also managed to deduce the circumference with a kind of surprising degree of accuracy. And what about sort of what we take to be moral truths, as it were, not factual truths? So, today we believe that, all people are born equal, and that, there's no kind of fundamental difference between people. But we have Aristotle, a very good thinker in many ways, but who believed that some people were in fact born to be slaves. So was Aristotle being a bad thinker, and were people who thought the earth was flat in the past bad thinkers? Or can we make accommodations given their context?
I would draw a distinction between empirical beliefs and moral ones. So rather than using the flat earth, because I do think that was, despite the public myths about that, I don't think it really wasn't a seriously broad belief among anybody with any learning. But let's take the case of the geocentric theory of the cosmos, that the earth is the center and all the planets and the sun and the stars revolve around the earth. In the 12th century, that might have been a perfectly reasonable thing to believe, and you didn't have to be a bad thinker to believe it. But once you hit the 17th century, and with Galileo's discoveries of the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, sunspots, and so on, evidence started building against the Ptolemaic hypothesis. And even though some people continue to insist on the geocentric vision for religious reasons or perhaps navigational reasons, because it was good for navigational purposes, nonetheless, as evidence grows over time in favor of the heliocentric hypothesis, it becomes irrational to continue stubbornly to hold on to the geocentric one. So in that case, no, it wasn't bad thinking to be a geocentrist in, let's say, the 12th, 13th century. With moral truths, though, I think it's different, because I don't think, and this is my view, and this will differ from what other philosophers have to say, I don't think these are empirical truths. I think it is true, absolutely true, that every human being, by virtue of being a human being, and I think this is also true of non-human animals as well, has certain rights and legitimate expectations as to how they're to be treated. And that includes treating them with dignity and not causing unnecessary suffering. I don't think any amount of empirical evidence well, let me back up a bit. Empirical evidence might get us to expand the notion of what creatures we think are capable of suffering. But the fact that a creature, the principle that a creature that's capable of suffering deserves certain rights, I don't think that's an empirical truth. And it's as true now and as justified now as it was 2,000 years ago. And so, yes, I think Aristotle was engaging in bad thinking to draw the conclusions that some people are fit by nature to be slaves.
All right. Well, I have a couple more questions, but because the Q&A questions are coming in and we're sort of moving ahead in time, I'll move to those. Maybe a relevant question to what we were just talking about. Do you believe that there is only one truth? People might have different views on the truth. In the West, people see things differently from people in other countries. And I guess this is perhaps more relevant to moral and ethical truth than sort of empirical truths. Can we say with absolute certainty that there is one truth of the matter?
No, certainly not. I do think there are certain truths that are, and again, this is not something that all philosophers would agree on. And so perhaps I'm engaging in bad thinking here, but I think I could defend this view. So it's not obviously bad thinking. I do think that there are certain truths that are true no matter where you are, when you are, or who you are. But I think there are other truths that are relative. I wouldn't want to say that the most important truths about how to treat other human beings, for example, that these are relative. It is true that in certain cultures, human beings are allowed to be treated in certain ways. We could see what's happening in Afghanistan right now as the Taliban roll back whatever progress has been made in the rights of women. So it's true that in Afghanistan, under the Taliban regime, women lack certain rights, but it doesn't make it morally true that those women should be deprived of their rights. So no, I do think there's a great variability as to what people think is true, but neither do I think that there is a single truth. I do think there are absolute truths, and mostly in the moral domain, perhaps. But then again, there are aesthetic truths about what's beautiful. And these, I think, they're not absolute. So I think we're willing to allow a certain degree of relativism or subjectivism when it comes to things like beauty and ugliness that, that are sort of in the mind of the beholder.
Here's a question from Joanna who says, what is the role of feeling in your account? Clearly, it can be a source of bad thinking. When people become very emotional, they can be led astray. But what is the relation to good thinking? And what would Spinoza say about feeling in this respect?
So Spinoza is a very interesting case in this with respect to this question, because he doesn't think that we should be these emotionless, rational beings who are struggling against our feelings. Rather, he argues that rational beliefs, knowledge, and understanding has its own affective power. And the reason why some people are led astray by their feelings is because their passions, their irrational beliefs, have more affect than their rational beliefs. So I do think that good feeling can be reinforced by, good thinking can be reinforced by feelings. And perhaps a good person would be somebody who doesn't just engage in the right way of thinking, but feels good about it. I think Aristotle was very good on this point. He says that the virtuous person doesn't just always think the right things, but they also feel the right feelings. They have the right emotional responses to situations, and they're good feelers as well as good thinkers.
Someone picking up on, maybe I'll merge two questions together. Someone was asking a question about trust, and we sort of briefly touched upon that, and how do we know which sources to trust, given that in the past even reliable sources have given us wrong information or have led us astray. And someone asks in relation, are Chomsky, Fisk, Said bad thinkers? What about Adorno, Foucault, and so on? since they were very critical of mainstream media and the way that, respectable sources of information like the New York Times or Le Monde present things. So again, the kind of suspicion that rational here seems to be too close to the meaning of liberal, capitalist, or neoliberal. Again, the kind of Nietzschean argument, I guess, that it sort of strikes someone as suspicious that the sources that you see as kind of respectable align closely to what the status quo in academia is saying. Most people in academia are liberal or progressive thinkers.
I think I do have the rationalist faith that were we all thinking reasonably, we would all come to the same conclusions. And I'd like to think that my beliefs are not directed by my political bias, but it's the other way around, that my political persuasions are directed by my rational beliefs. And even sources that I generally trust, I read critically. I don't take at face value everything I read in the New York Times or the Nation or the New York Review of Books or the Guardian, but rather I look at a variety of sources and try to decide, given probabilities, which of these are more likely to be telling me the truth or giving me a better story or better narrative about what's going on. So it's, as I said earlier, being rational is not just a matter of forming the right beliefs, but being able to assess all sources as to their reliability, and doing that in a way that makes use of probabilities. What would have to be the case for this report in this medium to be true? And is it the case that what would have to be true is so improbable that this report can't be right? I think that diversity is the key, diversity of sources.
Someone is putting another quite challenging question. Samantha says, there is a time pressure to our social problems, especially when it comes to things like climate change. Doesn't it seem more rational to assume that, if we have to wait for educational reforms, it seems more rational to assume that educational reforms is perhaps the best efficient way to solve our problems, and that democracy is not the ideal form of government to solve them either. In other words, maybe those are just going to take too long if we put our hopes in reforming education and reforming democracy in some ways to solve that problem. Whereas the discussion about power and how the rational people can take it over and wield it.
I've always been troubled by and this is especially true in the United States. I don't know if it's true in Britain or elsewhere, but there's a widespread conception that we don't want elites, intellectual elites in Congress or in the White House, that it needs to be somebody who's just one of us, somebody you can have a beer with. That troubles me. And I don't think Plato was right to be anti-democratic, but he was, I think I have to confess, I liked his idea of having philosophers be kings, or in this case, having intellectually elite people running our government. They shouldn't do so in an authoritarian way. But I'd be much happier if I knew that the people in Congress and the people in the White House were intellectually superior than me, both in terms of their knowledge of science, their knowledge of politics, their moral thinking. Boy, that would be a lot better. And for 4 years, and I'll say it, for 4 years, we had a total moron in the White House, and look where it got us. Maybe, and to think that Trump was just an ordinary bloke, that's bad thinking in and of itself. But this distrust of elites is troubling. I don't think you have to be anti-democratic to want to have people who are intellectually superior running things.
A question by
Now, I should say that I don't mean that we academic philosophers should be running things. That is not my point.
Yeah, academic philosophers can hardly run philosophy departments, from my
Exactly, that's
experience.
right.
So yeah, maybe some of our more talented graduates. Yeah. Um, Anne is asking a question which I think is interesting, and I'll add a little bit to it from my kind of question. So Anne is asking, what could be a good thinking method to counter the deliberate obfuscation of reality? For example, arguments based on the idea that truth is fundamentally unknowable. And I think where Anne is getting at, and I'll add my bit, which is that often sort of philosophical reasoning seems to be hijacked by people who want to argue for, climate change is, we don't know if it's real, maybe it's real, or in the past with the tobacco industry, where they use what seems to be philosophical methods of casting doubt, showing kind of like a healthy skepticism as the right way to treat these things. Say, well, nothing is proven, everything is a theory and we don't have proof, and all that sort of adoption of philosophical language, but and it's sort of by distorting it, if you like, to make arguments that are bad arguments. What do we do with that?
Well, I think there are two ways in which philosophy can be misused. One is to create the appearance of logical rigor. And so it looks like you're arguing deductively or performing a good inductive argument. But in fact, when you look closely, you can see that there are premises missing, that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises and so on. And I think one of the lessons of a philosophical education is that it teaches you how to recognize a proper logical argument or proper argument from an improper argument. It is a fallacious argument from a valid argument. The other way in which logic can be misused is maybe the argument is a perfectly valid one, that the conclusion that they are defending does indeed follow from their premises, but the premises themselves are false. So people who might argue that climate change, that claims about the human sources of climate change is a hoax, given whatever premises they're starting with, maybe they're arguing with perfect validity to the conclusion they draw. But if their premises aren't any good, then it's our job to point out where they've gone wrong. And that should, again, take place in a rational manner by presenting them with premises that are either obviously true or showing where their premises are obviously false, or perhaps using probability to show that, well, yeah, their premises are possible, but then they're highly unlikely.
Okay, a question from Mark, and it's quite a long one, so I'm going to sort of only answer the first bit, which is, how would you respond to someone who doesn't accept the desirability of rational thinking in the sense in which you're defining it? And then maybe a footnote to that will be that, a lot of philosophers have also expressed skepticism about the value of reason and rationality, especially in this kind of Enlightenment form. So, people like Theodor Adorno, for example, talk about how reason can often distort reality, can often make things that are very different, appear to be the same, categorizing things under universals, that sort of kind of line of argument. So what would you say? How would you engage someone who just doesn't see a virtue in rational thinking in that way?
So one question I have for this person would be, do you mean that the problem is with rationality itself, or is the problem that we have different notions of what counts as rationality? One person's rationality might be another person's irrationality. But putting that question aside, it's not our claim in the book that every dimension of your life should be governed in a rational way. It would, when we respond to art or music, or when we relate to other people in emotional ways, we are not often being very rational, nor should we. We may not be perfectly rational. In fact, it would be an odd thing if in choosing to form a relationship with another person, a long-term loving relationship, it was a matter of rational calculation. It's rather that in certain cases, in certain very important cases, to respond in an emotional way is not the best way, it's not appropriate. But we're not demanding that you live the the perfectly rational life, the life of Mr. Spock on Star Trek. And of course, Mr. Spock himself in that TV show often made great mistakes because he tried to use rationality when it was not appropriate, when trying to understand human reactions to things. So, don't mistake our thesis for saying that we should always be thinking about whether we're behaving in an epistemically responsible way.
To go back to our discussion about what the remedy is and how education can play a role in this, Bill is asking, how is studying 17th century Russian literature going to train someone on evidential and critical thinking? Wouldn't it be better to explicitly teach how to approach assessing evidence, what the nature of expertise is, what double-blind studies mean, how to understand statistics, etc.?
It might be, but I think that without concrete examples of the kind you find in literature, all you're going to have is very abstract thinking. But take Crime and Punishment. Here we have a portrait, not a very attractive one, of a man whose thinking has gone wrong, very wrong, in serious moral ways. Even in my philosophy classes, if you don't give examples, if you don't bring it down to earth in concrete ways with illustrations, students are simply not going to grab the message. The trouble with reading Spinoza, for example, is that he rarely gives you a concrete example. It's always very abstract. The other thing about literature, and this goes back to the earlier questions, is that these are not always lessons in rational thinking, but there are lessons in emotional thinking. Literature and the visual arts, and in fact, all sorts of arts, engage us in emotional ways, which may not be directly forms of rational thinking, but lead to a well-rounded life, and therefore make possible, bring us to, I think, a better state as rational agents. Maybe not because they give us lessons in rational thinking, but they provide an education in being an agent, which is what we are.
Okay, so our last question, and maybe I'll slip in my last question in there as well. Peter is asking, do you consider your book to be a piece of public philosophy? And what do you think the role of public philosophy should be? And maybe a corollary to that question by me would be, do you think that your book can change the mind of someone who's a bad thinker, or are you just preaching to the choir?
Yeah, that's the tough question. Will the people who most need to read the book actually end up reading it? Perhaps not, but our hope is, I'll get to the first part of the question in a second. Our hope at least is that we all know people who are bad thinkers. In some cases, there are people who are sometimes bad thinkers, and perhaps we live with them. And there are other people who seem to be chronically bad thinkers. And I think our hope is that people who read the book will know how to respond. I mean, it never goes well when you say to your spouse or your children and you point out their fallacies in their reasoning. This is not a good way to end a dinner conversation.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there's a time and a place, and it may be that the people who read this book will be better equipped to recognize bad thinking when they come across it, and even to engage in conversations that help people move towards a more rational way of approaching things. It would be, we do think of this book as a bit of public philosophy, and I think it's a shame, and I think this is more true in the United States than it is in Britain and France and elsewhere. Philosophers tend not to be public intellectuals. If you go back to the tragic events of 9/11, when the media wanted commentary on how we should think about what happened, they went to historians, politicians, other journalists, even artists and poets. But rarely did you see the media go to philosophers, because philosophers don't have that high profile in our intellectual culture. I think this has changed somewhat over the last 2 decades. And now we have some very fine public philosophers, people like Martha Nussbaum, Charles Taylor, and others. Whereas in Britain, I've always got the sense that philosophers, people like Bernard Williams, take a much greater role in public life, even serving on commissions. So I do think philosophers can and should be allowed to take to be more public and to be writing more editorials, participating in on commissions and governmental committees. Yeah, I think that would be make us for a much better civilization.